Okay, so let's begin. I should start by introducing myself. I'm Alan Barra, Director of the ESRI, and you're all very welcome along this morning to our post-budget analysis webinar. So sort of older friends of the ESRI will remember for many years we used to do a post-budget analysis, and it typically got sort of published initially as an article in the Irish Times and later as an article in the Quarterly Economic Commentary. But last year we experimented for the first time and tried to have a more interactive event where instead of just doing a newspaper article, we moved in the direction of having a sort of a mini conference or workshop to present our post-budget analysis. So anyway, it obviously went very well last year, and we decided we would do something similar this year, albeit in an altered circumstance. So the way things are going to run, my three colleagues, Barra Roantree, Karina Doorley, and Claire Keane, are going to take you to various elements of the ESRI's post-budget analysis. And I won't give any of the game away yet by mentioning sort of things they'll be talking about. They'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then the plan at that stage is we'll try and do a Q&A if everybody can use this to type in your questions through the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to moderate the discussion, pass on the questions, possibly summarizing some of them and joining them or whatever, but we'll try and get as many questions answered as possible. And I think we'll expect to go on till about maybe sort of 11:15, 11:20, that sort of range. And I should also say that we're joined by Kieran McQuinn, who takes obviously the more macro perspective on the budget. So if there are questions coming up of more macro orientation, Kieran will be happy to take those. So I think those are all the preliminaries I need to deal with at the outset. So I think, Barra, it's now time for me to hand over to you, and I think you'll do the share screening and start talking. And is that if I do think you're drifting on time-wise, which I'm sure you won't, I might just give you a nod to make sure we nudge things along as much as possible. So over to you, Barra. Do you need to unmute, Barra?
There we are. Can you see now all right?
Yeah, we can see perfectly.
Great. Sorry, thanks, Mel. Great, thanks very much, Alan, and thank you everyone for coming along today to the ESRI post-budget briefing. What we're going to talk about today is work that's been done over the last few days by the Tax, Welfare and Pensions team led by my colleague Claire Keane. That's also Karina Doorley will be also speaking today, but then also involved were Alvia McTighe, Seamus O'Malley, Dora Tudor, Mark Regan and myself. And so the agenda really is that I'm going to first tell you a little bit about the tax and welfare measures that were announced in the budget. Then Karina and Claire are going to take you through the impact of the pandemic on incomes, because that's the important context to what I suppose happened on Tuesday. And then also the distributional poverty and inequality impacts of the budget measures on households, taking account of that impact of pandemic-related job losses. But so I'm going to start then with the tax and welfare measures in budget 2020 for the next 15 minutes or so. And really, I think you will have heard over the week that the budget announced quite a large increase in spending. And really, it's kind of right to think about that as record levels of spending continuing into 2021. The record levels that we're seeing this year are really going to continue into next year. Just how big is that increase from what we were spending? Well, current spending is going to be about 25% higher than it was in 2019, so quite a significant jump. And while most of the announcements on Tuesday related to increased spending on public services and also grants for businesses affected by public health measures, there was also quite significant announcements in the areas of tax and welfare. So welfare spending is going to be about 510 million higher next year because of announcements made, and taxes will be about 265 million net lower because of those announcements. So what I'm going to do is talk you through some of these tax and welfare reforms, what they kind of are doing, and what some kind of public policy economics will have to say about them. Looking first at direct taxes, where there's some tweaks and changes. Then looking at indirect taxes, where there's kind of more tweaks and changes, before finally finishing up with look at welfare payments, where there was some quite significant reforms. So starting on direct taxes on personal income. So most tax thresholds and bands were frozen in cash terms. And what that actually means is that it amounted to a small effective tax rise. Now, that tax rise was very, very small because essentially forecast inflation is about 0.2%. And the reason that this is a tax rise is essentially if you have a tax credit of 1,650 as the personal tax credit that everyone gets, well, that's worth a little bit less to you next year than this because you can buy less goods and services with that tax-free kind of allowance. So, you know, it was a very small effective tax rise. I think it is important to stress the small bit, given the kind of macroeconomic environment that we're in at the moment. But it was a very small tax rise nevertheless. The minister did also find some scope to announce some tax cuts, actually. So the first of these was an increase in the point that the main universal social charge and employer PRSI rates begin to apply. And the rationale given for that was because the Low Pay Commission has recommended a 10 cent per hour increase in the minimum wage. The minister wanted to make sure that that didn't push any full-time minimum wage worker into the main PRSI bracket in particular, because that would lead to a jump up in employer costs and could have negative consequences on employment. So that's really kind of a feature of the design of PRSI, which has this cliff edge structure. And so the minister wanted to avoid that and so increase that threshold a little bit. But the reason for that, that happens every year now because of essentially the structure of the PRSI system, which is maybe something to look at. There was an extension also of the reduced universal social charge rate for people holding a medical card. So that's something that was introduced a few years ago. If you have a medical card, you pay a lower rate of universal social charge. And that was meant to be a temporary measure, but it's been kind of extended each year, each budget for the last few budgets. There was also, though, an increase in some tax credits, notably for the self-employed. So historically, self-employed are paid higher rates of income tax on the same levels of income as an employee because they had a smaller tax credit. Over recent years, successive governments now have moved to equalise those tax credits, and that was what was achieved in the budget on Tuesday. So you now have equal income tax treatment of the self-employed and employees. However, high-paid self-employees will still pay a surcharge of USC. But the biggest difference now remains in terms of PRSI. So actually the self-employed pay much lower rates of PRSI, despite the fact that actually in recent years, the benefits that you're entitled to for that PRSI have more or less aligned very closely now. So that's something, again, that the government has indicated it might want to look at in future budgets and is expect to arise in future again. So as well as those kind of tweaks to the direct taxes and personal income, there's also an extension of various tax reliefs announced. The enhanced Help to Buy scheme is going to be extended at the end of 2021 at a cost of 43 million. So this was a scheme which was introduced in 2016 with the stated aim of helping first-time buyers get a deposit, that 10% deposit that you need to buy a house. It's actually cost more than 300 million to date versus the anticipated cost when it was announced of 130 million. And part of that's because it's been extended repeatedly, but also it's been made more generous over the last few months. It's worth noting that over half of claims are for a home that is worth more than 300,000. So that's really that's above the average home bought by a first-time buyer. So the scheme is really being availed of mostly by people who are in the top end of the first-time buyer market. And interestingly, 40% of claims had a loan to value of less than 85%. So what that tells us is actually 40% of those claims already had more than already had that 10% deposit when they got the Help to Buy support. And so there's kind of a question there about, is this policy particularly well targeted? It seems to be benefiting a lot of people who already had the deposit for their house and are looking at the upper end of the first-time buyer market. And it's also something that, as multiple commentators draw attention to, is likely to fuel house price growth, simply because it's a demand-side measure. So it is likely to put upward pressure on prices. There were some other reliefs for companies and landowners that were extended, so we listed some of them there. Some of them, not all of them, have a known cost of the extension, but what was very positive to see was that they were extended alongside the publication of an evaluation. So what the government has started doing in recent years is evaluating the various tax reliefs that are offered and publishing the results of those online at the same time as the decision to extend them. So that's a very positive step to see that there's an active ongoing evaluation of the various tax reliefs and that feeds into the decision whether or not to extend them. However, like last year, there was more tweaks to indirect taxes than direct taxes. So there was a well-flagged €7.50 per tonne increase in the rate of carbon tax, around 28% or so rise in the rate of that tax. And the evidence, overwhelming evidence from both Ireland and internationally, shows that increase in this tax will reduce emissions with very little wider economic cost. And so that's something, that it's by no means the solution to climate change, but it's very much a necessary part of the strategy to addressing that important issue. However, it's well known that carbon taxes have disproportionate effects on lower income groups, and that's something that our own research has drawn attention to, as well as that of others. And what the government did was to announce some compensation measures for lower income households, particularly vulnerable ones. And that was informed by some recent ESRI research, which was published on our website this week by Seamus O'Malley, John Curtis, and myself, which essentially set out, well, what are the various ways that you might compensate lower income households? And they seem to have incorporated that into their decision making on Tuesday. In addition, and elsewhere in indirect tax world, there was a cash freeze to most excise duties. The one exception was tobacco, where an extra 50 cents was put on a pack of 20 cigarettes. And so in recent years, and maybe for longer than that, excise duties have been used as kind of an old reliable to raise revenue. But it's important to remember that they're also set to target social harm. So in the case of tobacco, the costs that arise both to individuals and also to wider society from smoking, that has health consequences, and the excise duty is designed in some way to address that. So what would be good to see is kind of, more research maybe around this area, but what is the level of taxation that cigarettes should attract in order to address that harm. And it's not just an ad hoc 50-cent increase every year, but rather we're trying to direct that towards social harms. And the same applies in terms of, I suppose, drink duties, and that there's an externality there that these duties are designed to address. But perhaps the bigger measure that was announced in the indirect tax was the reduction in VAT on hospitality and hairdressing. So this was something that was much discussed in recent weeks and is forecast to cost around 400 million through to the end of 2021. So two rationales have really been put forward for this tax cut. The first is that it might stimulate demand in an area with hospitality, which has been particularly badly hit by the pandemic. But there's also been another argument advanced that, well, it'll actually allow for retailers in those areas to have higher margins, and they won't pass on the tax reduction, but it will allow them to have a higher margin and so therefore get through this pandemic. Those are both two different arguments that you can have in favour of reducing the VAT rate. There's, however, maybe questions about how timely or targeted it is. So in terms of the timeliness, we know from international evidence that the reason that people aren't spending, or that spending is depressed, is because people are afraid of going out and contracting the virus. So that's really what's suppressing spending. And it means that as a stimulatory measure, cutting VAT rate isn't likely to be particularly effective at this time. In terms of the targetedness of the tax cut, well, we know that actually, only people who would be able to gain from the higher margins on sales are those businesses remaining open. And they're the ones who are actually probably the least worst affected of those in the hospitality area. So from that point of view, there's questions maybe about how timely or targeted this measure is. Maybe it might be better operating next year. There's also questions about, is it really going to be temporary? So we've seen this reduction in VAT for these kind of goods before, and done was meant to be temporary, a 2-year measure back then. It took several years for it to be reversed. So this might end up going on longer than 2021. It wouldn't be entirely surprising. Elsewhere on indirect taxes, the other major change was a change in how cars registered from January are to be taxed. So we know cars, when they are imported into the country, new or second-hand, are a vehicle registration tax is paid on them. So that's a tax paid in the open market sales price. Then cars are also subject to motor tax, which is a recurrent tax. Now, both of those taxes are based on essentially the emissions of the car. That was a change that we moved towards in around 2008. And those emissions are measured according to a European system. As some of you might remember from a few years ago, there was a kind of scandal around that, where it turned out that many of the car manufacturers were exploiting, if not falsifying, their the emissions measurements of their cars. So what the government has announced, they're going to move towards a new system of emissions measurement, which is more accurate, which kind of correctly accounts for the on-road performance of those vehicles in terms of their emissions. And so that's going to push most cars up into higher brackets, because we're using more accurate measurement of how much they actually emit, and that feeds through to the VRT and motor tax that's charged. At the same time, they've announced a reform to the rate schedule for both VRT and motor tax. So what actually is happening here is that in motor tax, at least, it's been cut pretty much across the board, so that there won't be much of a change in the motor tax that cars attract. In VRT VRT has been cut more for less emitting cars, and it's been increased slightly for the most emitting cars. It's not as dramatic as the change that was proposed over the summer. There was a government publication that came out and suggested a more radical reform. That's not what's happened. It's more kind of modest reform. But really the major thing that's going on here is we're getting more accurate measurements of the emissions of cars. And so it's not as much of a tax rise as being made out because of changing government. It's because cars are actually more emitting more than they said they were. More broadly, though, this doesn't really address the fundamental problems that we have with our system of motor taxation. So improving emission standards are going to continue to erode the revenue base over the coming decades. There's about 3 billion plus of revenues a year that are linked to the emissions of cars, and those are ultimately going to decline as the car fleet decarbonizes. So there's a real kind of longer run challenge to the public finances there in dealing with that issue. Also, the largest external cost of motoring isn't actually anything to do with emissions or climate change. It's congestion in urban areas, and figures from the European Commission show that actually congestion in urban areas is particularly costly in Ireland. So given that, there's maybe a strong case for looking at move towards road pricing or congestion charging as a replacement for the system of motor taxes that we currently operate in the country. And so that's something that no doubt will be looked at in future years. So that's kind of everything on the tax side. I just want to finish up by looking a bit at the welfare measures that were announced, because while most rates were frozen, there were some targeted increases that are actually quite important and maybe haven't got as much attention during the week as they deserved. So firstly, there was a significant increase in both the living alone increase and the fuel allowance. These are payments paid, as the name suggests, to people living alone in the first instance, particularly single retirees. But also the fuel allowance is paid to low-income retirees, as well as those in receipt of some other welfare payments, notably disability allowance. So there was actually quite big increases in those. The living alone allowance went up by €5 and the fuel allowance by €3.50. So quite big increases to those benefits, which will benefit people claiming those payments. There was also increases in payments for low-income adults with children. So the first of these was a very sensible measure where the cliff edge was removed from one-parent family payment. So that's a benefit received by low-income lone parents who work only a few hours. They previously were only allowed to earn up to €425 a week before their payment was lost. They can now work more than that. So a lone parent will be able to take on additional hours, say in a job, or work an additional day a week without fear of losing their one-parent family payment. So that's going to lead to a boost to incomes for lone parents who are in work. Couples in work where at least one person works more than 19 hours a week are entitled to receive working families payment, previously called family income supplement. And the maximum rates of that were increased by €10 a week for those with 3 or less children. So that's going to benefit quite a lot of low income working families with children. Finally, there was an increase in the main welfare payments for those with children, both lone parents and couples with children, and that increase was €5 a week for those with a kid age 12, for each kid age 12 plus, and €2 a week for a kid age under 12. And so those are really quite significant increases, and they're very well targeted actually at reducing child poverty, because they're payments that go to the lowest income families with children, and so they're very well directed at those children who are living in poverty, and as my colleagues will discuss later on, do actually have a significant effect on that. Other changes in terms of welfare, there was an increase in the amount you can earn before your disability allowance or your pandemic unemployment payment if you're self-employed is means tested. So what that'll mean is that in the case of the pandemic unemployment payment, say a taxi driver will be able to do a few runs during the week or over the month without risk of losing the pandemic unemployment payment. So very much, I'm sure, welcome by them. There was also an announcement that the Christmas bonus, which is a double welfare payment around the start of December, will be paid to those who've been receiving a welfare payment for at least 4 months. So typically this is only paid to those receiving payment for more than 14 months. It's been reduced, that threshold, to 4 months, and so there'll be a lot more people receiving that. However, it does mean the 4-month condition, even though it's going to be over the year as a whole, does mean that some who lose their jobs in the coming weeks may be excluded from that payment, and that's something that we know that might be likely to happen if we move to a higher level of lockdown measures in relation to COVID. But really the biggest change that was announced in terms of welfare was the decision to delay the rise in the state pension age. This was set to rise to 67 in January, but that's now been deferred to a commission on pensions, which is to be established and make a recommendation on this area. But it is worth noting that it is a very expensive decision, so it cost $220 million in 2021, with potentially much larger costs in the long run, something that the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council have drawn attention to over the summer. So there is a big decision to be made around what happens to the state pension, and that is, the Commission on Pensions' recommendations are going to be quite important. So just to wrap all that up and to kind of conclude before and pass over to my colleague Claire Keane, the budget really contained a lot more policy changes than had been anticipated. Well, certainly than we were anticipating having to look at a few days ago. There was lots of tweaks to both direct and indirect taxes, and despite a freeze to core welfare rates, social protection changes were quite significant and will act to reduce child poverty. But really, the decisions that were announced on Tuesday pale in comparison to the role of the tax and welfare system's automatic stabilisation effect. So if you look at the estimates that were published on Tuesday, the Department of Social Protection spending is set to be about 25 billion in 2021, more than double its 2019 level of about 10.7 billion. So there's been a huge increase in spending. But that very little of that is due to policy changes. The vast majority of this extra spending is because the benefit system is doing its job of supporting people's incomes when they lose their job or when their hours or income fall. And so really it's kind of automatic. And I think that's kind of important to keep in mind, that while we focus a lot on the changes announced in the budget, really what's going on and what's quite important is what the welfare system does automatically. And from that point of view, my colleagues Claire Keane and Karina Doorley are going to talk you through what's happened in relation to the pandemic and and what effect the changes that I've talked you through in this presentation have on families' income, inequality and poverty.
That's it. Yeah, excellent. Okay, great. Thanks, Barra. So yeah, as Barra was saying there, myself and Karina are going to discuss more the kind of distributional poverty and inequality impacts of Budget 2021. But of course, Budget 2021, it's fairly standard around this time of year. We'll present what was the distributional impact of the budget, who are the kind of winners and losers of the budget, what income groups gained most or lost most because of the changes in policy. But as I'm sure we all realize this year, looking at Budget 2021 on its own would be sort of inaccurate without taking account of the wider pandemic that has happened. So we're going to look at the distributional impact of Budget 2021, but also we're going to take a step back and look and see what impact COVID itself has had on people's incomes in Ireland over the last year. And also what impact what we're going to refer to as the COVID policy. So things like the pandemic unemployment payment and the wage subsidies that were introduced, what impact have they had? So we'll be looking at distributional impact, but also a big question is what impact has the COVID pandemic had on inequality and poverty in Ireland? And we're going to present some results on that. So just to put it into context, if we have a look at the change in employment that has happened in the last year. So here I have the change in employment by sector from Q2 of 2019 to Q2 of 2020. So up on the top right-hand side of the screen, we can see that there are some sectors where there is a growth in employment in the last year. But of course, down on the bottom left-hand side here, we can see the very large employment shock that happened, affecting particularly the services sector and the accommodation and food service activity sectors. Therefore, we see a sharp rise in unemployment, and here I'm focusing on the unemployment rate by age. So if we look at the black line, we have the rise in unemployment happening in February, and I should point out that this will include people in this definition of the unemployment rate. It will include people who are on the pandemic unemployment payment, but not those people whose jobs were saved by the wage subsidy. So it could have been even sharper if they hadn't have been implemented. So we can see that overall from February up to April, we see a rise from almost full employment before the COVID pandemic to over 30% by April. It's reducing down, but it's continuing to be higher than it was before. And of course, will be very much linked to the restrictions that we see around the country and how long the pandemic measures have to continue. But really what we see on this graph is the fact that 15 to 24-year-olds have been very strongly impacted in terms of their unemployment rate. So by over the summer, the unemployment rate of this age group, this younger age group, going to above 60%, much higher than those in older age groups, which is shown by the green line in this graph. If we look at the unemployment rate by gender, we don't see a huge pattern by gender. So we do see at the initial sort of onset of the pandemic in March and April, we see that the unemployment rate of men rose more sharply than that of women. And then a slight change in that more recently in the summer months. But by September, roughly the unemployment rates of men and women are looking the same on average over the entire workforce. However, if we look at the youth unemployment rate by gender, we do see a gap here. So here we have the black line showing the overall youth unemployment rate, and we can see that the blue line is above the grey line. So basically the unemployment rate for young women is higher than for young men, and it's continuing to be so even by September. The gap hasn't closed. So that might be just something to bear in mind when we're thinking about policy going on into the future. Okay, so as I said, we're going to focus on the budget, but we're also going to look at the impact of the responses that were put in place during the year prior to the budget in reaction to the COVID pandemic. So we have the pandemic unemployment payment, and this was initially a two-tier payment, depending on previous earnings. It changed more recently in September to a three-tier payment, and there's a lot of debate and discussion around the changes, and also around the fact that the pandemic unemployment payment is due to close to new applicants by the end of 2020 and be removed entirely by April 2021. So we're going to have a bit of a discussion around that when we look at our results. The temporary wage subsidy scheme was brought in to protect employment and replaced by the employment wage subsidy scheme in September. So we're going to look at the impact of that. And also we take into account the fact that before the budget, there was a standard VAT rate cut during the year with a reduction from 23 to 21%. So this is going to be our sort of pre-budget COVID policies that we look at. Then in terms of budget 2021, so Barra has taken you through quite a lot of these measures, but the measures that we analyse are really those ones that impact upon people's individual sort of or family disposable incomes. So while there was no changes in income taxes, we look at the earned income tax credit increase and the increase in the second rate USC band. And again, as Barra pointed out, there was no change in the sort of headline social welfare personal rates in all of the schemes, but there were different things like the increases for qualified children going up, increases in living alone allowance, etc. And in part, these have been a response to the rise in carbon tax. So we're also going to take account of the fact that there's been a carbon tax increase and tobacco tax increases. And we know from previous research that these are more likely going to be regressive increases. So we'll see, has the tax benefit system managed to cushion those increases? And then we'll also take account of the fact there was a VAT reduction for hospitality and tourism. So again, just to sort of recap, first of all, how we're doing this. So we're doing this using Switch, which is the ESRI tax benefit model. And the tax benefit model, it's currently based on data from the CSO from 2017, but we're adjusting that data to be representative of the current 2020 population. So what we do in that data is we're implementing this sort of COVID shock, this unemployment shock on family incomes. And we calibrate that employment shock to latest CSO data. So going back to those figures I showed you earlier, calibrating that to which sectors have lost out most in terms of employment. Then we go on and we can see then the effect that COVID is having on family incomes if there were to be no policy reaction. So if the PUP and the employment wage subsidies hadn't come in, then we'll add in the impact of those initial COVID policies. And then finally, we'll also show the impact of budget 2021 on people's incomes. So a major advantage of using something like Switch is that a lot of the time around budget time, we see standard cases. So, you know, a family on this income with 2 children, etc. How are they affected by the budget? But the advantage of Switch is that we're relying not on looking at particular individuals or family types, but rather we're working off a representative sample of the entire Irish population. And just a couple of points on the methodology. We're starting with adjusting last year's tax benefit system by the CPI. Now, what that's doing is effectively saying, are we keeping pace with inflation? So if inflation has gone up, are the changes that have happened keeping pace with that? And that's important, for example, say for those on social welfare, that social welfare rates would continue to keep pace with inflation so that those incomes don't fall behind in terms of purchasing power. And then as well, we're assuming in these results that we present today that half of the jobs saved by the employment wage subsidy scheme would have been lost in the absence of the scheme. And I'm going to discuss maybe why that's important now in a moment when we talk about the costs of these different measures. So there's lots of debate around the cost of the pandemic unemployment and the wage subsidy schemes and, you know, when they should be withdrawn, how they should be withdrawn. what impacts they will have when they are eventually removed. But as Barra sort of alluded to in his presentation, it's important to bear in mind what we call the automatic stabilization. So the tax benefit system that already existed is still there and would still have an impact for people. So for example, if the pandemic unemployment payment hadn't been introduced, there would be other benefits that a large, certain proportion of PUP recipients would be entitled to, the standard job seekers payments, for example. So here we're just looking at the sort of exchequer costings. We're doing $1 million per month because there's a lot of uncertainty around how long the pandemic will continue and how long we're going to see these effects. But it's really just to illustrate this automatic stabilization effect. So basically here we have the sort of net exchequer impact. So that's the red figures at the bottom. So how much it's costing the exchequer per month if there'd been no policy response. So we've got two alternatives. The first is where we assume that none of those getting the employment wage subsidy would have actually lost their jobs. So that's probably, a bit unrealistic, but it's sort of an upper bound. And in the second column with no policy response, we're assuming that half of those on the wage subsidy would become unemployed. And what you can see from these figures, so obviously there would have been a much sharper shock to earnings under these two different scenarios, but also the fact that tax revenues will continue. So when the employment wage subsidy was introduced, by keeping people in their employment, we were continuing to get taxes and social insurance charges from these people, which was helping to sort of buoy the finances of the government. And also there will be different changes in welfare expenditure. So for example, in our first two scenarios where there is no pandemic unemployment payment or wage subsidy, the existing social welfare scheme kicks in there to help protect people's income. Again, these costs differ depending on how many people we think would have actually lost their job if the wage subsidy hadn't come into place. It's also important to bear in mind that there are other costs, bar the sort of headline welfare expenditure measures. Things like entitlements to medical cards can be important. So as people lose their job, more people will become entitled to things like medical and GP visit cards, and there's a cost there for the exchequer. So we can see that the third column shows where the COVID policies have actually been implemented. So if you look at the kind of jump in cost from having no policy response to having a policy response, the jump in cost is maybe not as high as we would think. It's certainly not as high as just adding up the pandemic unemployment cost and the employment wage subsidy cost, because of the fact that in having those schemes in, first of all, on the wage subsidy side, you're helping to protect tax revenues. Second of all, on the pandemic unemployment payment side, some of those people getting that would have been entitled to other benefits if that scheme hadn't been introduced. Okay, so I think that's it on the cost side. I'm going to hand over to Karina, who's going to look at the distributional analysis.
Thanks, Claire. Let me just get my screen up. Can you see that okay?
Yep, all good, Karina.
Great, thanks. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show you the distributional analysis. So how have both employment losses due to COVID, coupled with the COVID policies and Budget 2020, affected family incomes, and how has this differed across the income distribution? So the first thing I want to show you is the distributional effect of employment losses with and without COVID policies and Budget 2021. So what I've done here is divided households into equally sized groups according to their income levels. So the lowest income families are in quintile 1 and the highest income families are in quintile 5. And if you look at the blue line for starters, this shows the average income loss within that quintile due to COVID-related employment losses if there were no targeted policy responses this year. So no PUP, no wage subsidy scheme, and no Budget 2021. So looking first at quintile 1, you can see that there's actually an average no gain or no loss in this quintile. And that's kind of the product of two facts. The first is that there are fewer workers in this quintile, so they are less susceptible to the employment shock for a start. And the second is that the tax benefit system, the existing tax benefit system, actually does a pretty good job of cushioning the incomes in this quintile when there is a job loss that results in lower income. So quintile 1 is not terribly affected on average by employment losses. As you move further up the income distribution, quintile 2, we see losses of between 3 and 4% in the absence of any targeted measures. And quintiles 3, 4 and 5 really see the largest income losses on average due to COVID-related unemployment. So what I want to show you next is the red line. So this is what happens when we introduce the pandemic unemployment payment and the employment wage subsidy scheme. So what you can see is that in quintile 1, we're now actually seeing average income gains of about 2 or 3%. And this is because it's something that we flagged in earlier research, and it's something that's been quite widely discussed in the media and policy circles. It's because for some people, some very low income people or part-time workers, and the pandemic unemployment payment is actually more generous than their in-work income. So when they lose their jobs and become eligible for the PUP rather than for traditional job seeker supports, there is an average small gain in that quintile. And there is no average change in quintile 2. So incomes are on average completely cushioned in quintile 2 when we take into account the PUP and the wage subsidy scheme. And there are very small losses in quintiles 3 and 4. So the only quintile where the large losses remain is quintile 5. If you look then at the green line, this adds on budget 2021 to this scenario. So what you'd see is that the trend sort of continues, right? So the difference between the red and the green line is a lot smaller than the difference between the blue and the red line, because really the pandemic policies did so much work earlier this year, and the marginal effect of the budget measures is quite small in comparison, but the trend is continuing. So the lowest income quintiles are being cushioned the most, so they're seeing larger income gains from budget 2021 compared to the higher income quintiles. So really the overall effect here is quite progressive when you take into account pandemic policies plus budget 2021. So if we look then at budget 2021 by itself, so here I'm comparing the budget to an indexed set of 2020 tax benefit policy parameters. As Claire indicated earlier, we've indexed the 2020 tax benefit system to take account of expected inflation for next year, and that's in order to be able to compare what actually happened to a situation where people's purchasing power would have remained the same. So if you look first at the blue bars, this shows the effect of the direct tax and welfare changes announced during budget 2021 by quintile. So there are relatively large gains in the lower 2 income quintiles, smaller gains in quintile 3 and 4, and almost nothing happens in quintile 5. If you look down at the red bars, this is the effect of indirect tax changes announced during budget 2021. And this, by contrast, has a pretty regressive effect. So there are small income losses in quintiles 1 and 2 as a result of these measures, compared to small income gains in quintiles 4 and 5. And that's because carbon tax and excise duties on tobacco tend to hit lower income households more than they do higher income households. But the overall effect represented there by the green line, which accumulates these two, both the direct and the indirect tax measures announced during the budget, is largely progressive. So the direct tax and welfare measures do more than compensate for the regressive nature of indirect tax changes. So the picture from the budget is of a progressive one. I want to talk to you next about income inequality and poverty and how we estimate that would have evolved. So firstly, in 2020, in the absence of COVID-related unemployment, so if there had been no pandemic, no associated unemployment, what would income inequality and poverty have looked like? And then take you through the other scenarios, so how COVID policies and how the budget have affected this. So I'm going to show you 2 indices for income inequality: the Gini of market income, which is pre-tax and transfer income, and the Gini of disposable income. And the thing to remember looking at these is that a higher number means more income inequality. So a value of 1 would be perfect income inequality, and a value of 0 is perfect income equality. So the Gini of market income in the first column, if we assume that there was no employment loss in 2020, is 0.51. The Gini of disposable income is 0.28. And the difference between these two really shows you what the work that the tax benefit system does in Ireland to equalise incomes. So the difference between these two is actually relatively high by international standards. So our tax benefit system does a good job of equalising incomes. And the next 3 statistics in this column show poverty rates. So here the poverty rate tells you how many people are at risk of poverty, where we define the poverty line as having disposable income of less than 60% of median equivalized disposable income. Okay, so the first figure tells you that 14% of individuals could be considered at risk of poverty according to this definition if there had been no employment loss this year. If you look at the working age population by itself, that increases slightly to 15%, and child poverty rates are higher again at 18%. If you look then at the second column, this shows you what happened, what would have happened to poverty and inequality rates due to employment loss due to COVID if there had been no targeted supports or no COVID policies. And so the Gini of market income increases quite significantly by 5 points to 0.56. The Gini of disposable income increases slightly to 0.29, but poverty rates really increase quite dramatically. So by 4 percentage points for the population as a whole and 5 percentage points for the working age and child population. These are quite dramatic increases. So I'm going to take you then to the final column, which shows you how we expect these indices to evolve given the COVID policies and the effective budget 2021 together. And what you'll see is that the difference between the first column and the final column is not very big. So the COVID policies and budget 2021 taken together are doing a pretty good job of stabilizing these income inequality indices and poverty rates. So the Gini of market income increases slightly, the Gini of disposable income actually decreases slightly, and poverty rates for the population as a whole and for the working age and child population increase by 1 point compared to an estimated 4 or 5 points if there had been no policy supports. So I suppose the takeaway from this is that the current supports are doing a very good job at stabilizing income inequality and poverty in the short term, but that's for as long as they're in place. If they're withdrawn, we could see ourselves returning to column 2 if there isn't adequate employment opportunity for people. Okay, so Claire already showed you that the unemployment rate of young people was much harder affected than the employment rate of, let's say, the population as a whole. So what I'm showing you here is the income losses by age cohort in, again, these 3 scenarios. So the red line shows you what would have happened in the absence of COVID supports. The blue line shows you how COVID supports helped cushion these losses. And then the green line adds in budget 2021. So it's quite clear that 18 to 29-year-olds would have suffered the largest income losses in the absence of any support. So this would have been an average of 14% decrease in disposable income. And this is tempered very much at about 5% of disposable income when we take COVID supports and budget 2021 into account. The next most affected group is the 30 to 39-year-olds, and then the effect gets smaller as we move up the age distribution. But what's interesting, I think, from this graph is that despite the huge difference in income losses by age cohort in the absence of supports, once the new COVID supports and budget 2021 are taken into account, there's actually very little difference in income losses by age cohort. But again, this kind of points to the fact that when these supports are withdrawn, as it's suggested will be done next year, it is young people that stand to lose the most if they can't find work. And there's also heterogeneity in the effect of employment losses by industry. So this chart shows the aggregate income loss within an industry from workers. So the average kind of salary loss for workers in a particular industry. So the 2 blue bars that stand out there are hotels and restaurants and other. So the hospitality sector we know has been very hard hit. Other includes the arts, so that's what's really contributing to the large decrease here. But what you'll see is that these 2 industries have been the most affected, but the supports are also doing a very good job of cushioning these industries, so they're doing quite a lot. And so the green line there will show you the income losses with COVID policies and budget 2021. So again, this has really dampened the losses, particularly for these industries, and points to the fact that if they are withdrawn, these are the industries that stand to lose the most. Just as an aside, the bars that I've shown in red here are those industries that colleagues of ours at the ESRI have indicated will be most hit by a no-deal Brexit. So they estimate that there is some overlap between the industries most affected by Brexit and by the pandemic, but not a huge amount, and that's kind of visible here. So I thought that was a nice silver lining to point out. And the last chart I'm going to show you is the effect of employment losses, COVID policies, and budget 2021 altogether by gender. So here we're using quintiles of disposable income again. And what you can see is that men have suffered larger income losses on average than women at all points of the distribution. And this, I suppose, really points to the fact it's not that the tax benefit system is doing less to cushion their income losses than it is for women. It's more the fact that men tend to work more often in paid work than women due to traditional gender divisions between work and caring roles. When they do work, they tend to work full-time more often, and they also tend to earn more. So any employment shock is going to disproportionately affect their disposable income compared to women. And so at least in the short term, it does seem like men have been harder hit by the pandemic in terms of income losses. But I'm just going to stress that that's a short-term effect that I'm showing you here, and I'm going to come back to this when we wrap up. Okay, so just to summarize, so using switch and a number of scenarios, we've shown that COVID-related unemployment has been very costly to the Exchequer, but actually the existing tax benefit system does account for at least half of the cost, so that's our best guess. And I think that's important to bear in mind because we hear a lot of talk about the cost of these policy supports of the pandemic unemployment payment and the employment wage subsidy scheme. And really the relevant cost that we should be discussing is the extra cost of these supports compared to what would have happened if the existing tax benefit system had been left to do its work. And so then that kind of halves the cost that you are considering. The policy response has definitely sheltered the lowest income groups, and that's been true both for the COVID policies and for Budget 2021, which has continued this trend. And just a number of policy challenges maybe to think about. So the PUP is set to be continued until April 2021, but closed to new applicants at the end of 2020. And I suppose there are kind of a couple of angles to take on this. The first is that we have shown that for some people, the pandemic unemployment payment is definitely more generous than their in-work income was pre-COVID. So if we find ourselves next year or the year after in a situation where there are lots of employment opportunities, it is certainly the case that the generous nature of the pandemic unemployment payment could provide a disincentive for people to look for work to actually join the labour force. So in that sense, it does make sense to taper it or to equalise it with existing job seeker supports once there are employment opportunities out there. But we have also seen that the withdrawal of this payment is likely to disproportionately hit low-income young single workers. And it may be necessary to look at other targeted supports, either through the existing tax benefit system or through new measures that may target this group in particular. So the employment wage subsidy scheme is set to be closed by the end of March 2021. And so wage subsidies style schemes are very useful in helping firms to adjust their labour and their output to cope with an economic downturn. But there is significant dead weight associated with them as well. And we can get to a situation where the state is propping up firms that in the long term are just not viable anymore. So there's certainly an efficiency argument to completely withdrawing the subsidy at some point, rather than trying to allow firms to come off it by themselves by increasing their turnover and kind of just not being eligible for it anymore. But the timing of that is going to be very tricky because it may be the case that some firms, if they are supported until there is a viable economic recovery, that they will last. But if they're not supported, they may go under prematurely. So that's going to be a difficult decision for policymakers to make next year. And I'm just going to finish by saying that, so it might appear that it'd be easy to conclude that men were hit hardest by employment losses due to the pandemic. But what I've shown you is an unemployment shock coupled with COVID policies, so support policies. What we haven't seen is how participation rates may have changed. And there is emerging international evidence, even from Northern Ireland very recently, that women were more likely to drop out of the labour market or to reduce their hours of work during the pandemic. And there is a large body of evidence that shows that career interruptions like this have a significant effect on the gender pay gap and on the gender work gap going forward. So that would be something to keep an eye on in the future. And I'll just refrain from making any firm conclusions about any gendered nature of income losses anywhere beyond the short term. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much for that, Karina. So we can move on to Q&A at this stage. I may have misspoke actually earlier on. I think I said we might go 20 past 11. I think I meant 22:11. So it'll give us about sort of 15 or 20 minutes for questions. And a couple have come in already. So again, if people want to submit questions, we can do it through the Q&A function, and I'll relay them. So a couple of very focused questions to begin with. So one from Donald de Butler, and Donald is asking about what assumptions are made on the VAT cut and the extent to which it is passed on to consumers. And then the supplementary on that then is obviously then, does it make a big difference to the analysis? So I'm going to let any of you sort of jump in at a point to answer that.
Yeah, so in terms of how we've modelled it, we're assuming it's fully passed on. So both the carbon tax increases and any of the indirect tax changes, we assume they're fully passed on. Of course, if they're not passed on fully, it won't be as beneficial. And we've seen from Karina's graph that the indirect tax measures, the sort of negative impact on incomes is more strongly felt in quintiles 1 and 2. So it may be that the sort of gains in quintile 1 and 2 aren't as extreme. But I think from what Karina showed there, the indirect tax measures, the direct tax measures are more than, are well compensating for the indirect tax changes. So we could certainly look at perhaps if only a proportion was passed on. But given that the direct tax measures and social welfare measures have more than, compensated, we should still expect to see sort of gains or protection for that bottom end of the income distribution.
Okay. Before I go on to the next question, I am going to ask a question myself. There's an element of clarification in this and then something more substantive. So in terms of the carbon tax, okay, and the extent to which the measures mitigated the negative distributional effects, I just want to be clear, are you saying that the specific recycling measures related to the carbon tax had that effect, or is it the totality of all the measures together meant that the effect was negated? Yeah, Barry, you want to?
Yeah, so I think it's important to take the totality of the budget package together. There's, we could separate out one measure or two measures and say, well, this offsets this, but that's kind of somewhat manufactured hypothecation. So I think the important thing is to take the budget package in the round, and from that point of view, as Claire and Karina have shown, the measures do very much compensate the lowest income groups. So there might be talk about hypothecation and all the rest, but really what matters is what happens when you take the budget package as a whole together, and that's what we've looked at here and shown that they do indeed offset.
Okay, so that really, I mean, I suppose that prompts then the thought that was in my head. Say in next year's budget, on the assumption that the carbon tax is going to go up by 750 again, but on the assumption that the government are not going to borrow 20 billion again and increase spending by 25%, can we take it then that it will be infinitely more difficult next year to compensate, and that the sort of, the standard concerns about carbon taxes that people have always sort of talked about, and that they'll be very much back in action?
So I think what the paper we published earlier this week shows is that you don't need to use a huge amount of the additional revenue raised from the carbon tax to compensate the lowest income households. We showed you can do so very effectively by using just a third of the revenue raised. So from that point of view, I don't think it's really dependent on the borrowing, because you've got some money coming in from the carbon tax going up, and you can use just a third of those proceeds and still compensate the lowest income households. So they probably won't there probably won't be as much measures next year, but at the same time, it is very, very, it is entirely plausible and possible and straightforward to do so. Just raise the welfare benefits given to low income families, particularly those who you think are most at risk or vulnerable.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Karina, very focused question from Paul Lynham. I'll read it out to you, okay? So it relates, so how do you square the increased impact on high income earners, as illustrated in your first graph, okay? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. As opposed to the lower income earners, with the fact that income tax revenue has held steady, which would lead us to believe that higher income earners haven't been significantly impacted?
There's a couple of parts to that question. So low income earners are not always in the bottom quintile. So the quintile is based on household income. So that's one thing. So the bottom quintile doesn't just have low income earners in it. Low income earners are probably more likely to be a little bit further up in quintiles too. The bottom quintile, there's likely to be a lot of social welfare recipients in there. Okay, so quintile 2 would probably contain more low income earners, but there are also low income earners in the top quintiles. They live in households where there are higher earnings also. there was a larger relative effect of employment losses on disposable income in higher quintiles because people earning in higher quintiles, when they lost their job, they weren't entitled to other supports typically. So they basically lost all of their income except for the cushioning of the pandemic unemployment payment, right? So that's why you see a much larger effect on their incomes. To me, that's not at odds with the revelations that, you know, income tax receipts have held up pretty well, because the people who lose their jobs in the bottom, low earners who lose their job aren't paying a lot of tax anyway. So we don't see a huge effect on their disposable income because the policy cushions their income, but also they're not having a huge effect on the exchequer in terms of lost income tax because they weren't paying a lot of income tax in the first place. So I don't think the two observations are at odds with each other.
Okay, well, I thought that was a tricky question to answer, I would think, because there was so many components on it, but maybe Paul can follow up with you if you need more of the detail. Okay, another one from Eamon Murphy, and Eamon's drawn a sort of a contrast. Last year's analysis, and I have to confess, I can't quite remember, was showing how the budget may have led to an increase in poverty. And this was because earnings were increasing, but welfare remained static. So I suppose in that relative poverty line might have moved. But Eamon's asking about for 2021 what the effect on poverty is. I don't know. I think you dealt with that. He's saying obviously with regard to child poverty, the QCA increase would have had a positive effect, but he's asking about poverty more generally.
So I remember making the point last year, and so there were predictions that wages would rise quite a lot in 2020. And there were also cash freezes to a lot of welfare rates. So that means that, you know, essentially there is this group of people that are being left behind in the income distribution. And we were estimating that would increase child poverty. The situation is very different this year. So the biggest effect on poverty this year and next year is going to come from the pandemic and not from policy changes made in the budget or even earlier on this year. Those changes, we estimate, will actually cushion child poverty that would have otherwise increased quite a lot as a result of employment losses.
Okay, actually there's just a very practical question from Ray Lydon of the Central Bank, and it's will the slides be distributed? So I presume the plan was to put the slides on the ESRI website once they could be there already, but anyway, that will be the plan.
We'll put them up after.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so question from Dermot O'Leary, and again I'll read it out because it's probably simpler than me trying to interpret. So have the changes to PUP been informed by the ESRI analysis on income gains in the lower income cohorts? And second part of the question, was there any evidence that the original rates of payment would impact negatively on incentives to work? So I don't know, does that?
So in terms of analysis, we haven't yet done analysis of the impact on work incentives. But you know, and you can see as well, it'll depend because the PUP is a flat rate payment with no increases for adults and children. And as you know, we've seen there's increases in qualified child increases this year. So some people may now be better off on other payments. So we haven't yet done analysis on that, but we do know that it is evident that there are some people who were better off on PUP than they would have been in unemployment. But in terms of quantifying it, we haven't yet looked at that.
Okay, another question related Leiden. It's the question of businesses calling for the EWSS subsidy to return to the TWSS levels. And I don't know, is that anything we have done anything on?
Not really. So we've modelled both. The temporary wage subsidy scheme is more generous and provided more cushioning. The EWSS is less generous, but also less costly. It's not something that we have any good data on whether one is working better than the other. Okay.
Thomas Confrey has another question, and again, you might have to just sort of think about this. I don't think it's necessarily part of the analysis, but Thomas's question relates to the increase in household savings, okay, which has obviously been quite dramatic. And the question is, do we have any insights on how savings have increased across income deciles?
No, you go ahead. I just, in terms of our data, we first of all don't have that, because even if we had up-to-date data from the CSO, from the Survey of Income and Living Conditions, it doesn't contain information on savings. So I'm not aware of, certainly not with Silk, can you look at income or savings by income deciles. I don't know if anybody else out there knows some other source that you can look at on that.
Well, you'd need an update on the HFCS, I suppose, is the definitive, assessment of savings in the economy. So, it's a very interesting question, because obviously, I mean, we talked about it in terms of QB2.
Actually, Kieran, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Maybe if you hold your microphone closer or something like that.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Brilliant. Yeah.
We talked a little bit about this in the commentary in terms of the implications, for instance, for something like housing demand down the road. So, I mean, it's something that actually we're thinking about in terms of our housing program, that I think something that we could look at. But in terms of definitive information at this point in time, you don't actually know any information on household savings until obviously the HFCS is updated.
Okay.
Just one thing to add to that, maybe, Alan. So work that we published earlier in the year. So the only thing I think that we've seen that might hint at this is that we know higher income households spend a larger share of their spending on things that were restricted, and that essentials make up a larger share of spending for lower income households. So that might suggest that if it's restrictions, which are kind of really restrictions on spending, which are really driving the rise in savings, it's probably going up higher on. But on the other hand, as we've shown, there kind of was a boost to income at the bottom. So there's kind of two offsetting effects there, but it kind of depends on which of those is likely to be more important.
Okay, another very sort of, I would say straightforward question. It's a succinct question. Were the inflation assumptions based on CPI for this year, or a projected increase in inflation for next year?
Yeah, so we used the projected one for 2021, didn't we? Yeah, so it's the projection for next year. So it's relatively low, it's not very large.
Okay. Another question that's related to my earlier one on carbon taxes. Again, I'm not sure if you'll have the answer to hand, but what policy was most effective in balancing out the rise in carbon tax on low-income households? So, Barra, maybe you can answer that from the analysis from earlier in the week.
Yeah, so absolutely. It really was the increase to the welfare payments for people with kids. So what they're called increases for qualified children in the jargon of the welfare system, but they're essentially additional payments made to those who are in receipt of, say, job seekers, one parent family payment, and you get an extra amount for each kid you have. And very simply, that's the most effective way at compensating that group for the carbon tax. So they also increased the fuel allowance and living loan increase. Those were very important in compensating, I suppose, more older households and households living, those households where there's only one person living on their own. But they tend to be a little higher up the income distribution. So in terms of, if you're thinking about what was most important in protecting low income households, was the rise to the IQCs, those welfare payments for low income families with kids. And if you're thinking about kind of vulnerable people maybe living on their own, it was the living alone increase and the fuel allowance.
Okay, thanks for that. Can I ask you, this is a way broader question, and let me come at it like this. So you guys have been analysing budgets for a long time, and in most of those budgets, there was a sort of maybe a welfare package and a tax package or whatever like that. But the overall thing was balancing in terms of we were running deficits or surpluses, whatever like that, which were kind of close to balance generally. So when doing the analysis this time, and there is a deficit of the order, I mean, correctly, a deficit of the order that it is, but isn't it really the case that there's almost a sense of where there's all the welfare and spending bit of it, but the tax bit was essentially then put aside, and that in a static year, for the year that's in it, the analysis, of course, stands up. But really, what we've done is we've sort of added, 40 billion to the national debt that is sitting there, and that there may have to be some scaling back at some stage. So there's a sort of thinking in a Ricardian's equivalent sort of way. There's almost like a deferred taxation dimension. So I don't know, did that sort of strike you as you were doing this, that it was a kind of a lopsided budget, again, correctly, but relative to ones you would have analysed previously?
I could jump in there. I suppose one thing that strikes me is a comparison back to the Great Recession. So the work we did at the Great Recession, we would see the sort of initial budgets were quite progressive, And then as the need for tax measures really kicked in, so the initial budgets, I mean, if we think about the 08 and 09 budgets, there was increases in social welfare at a time when tax revenues are falling. And then there was sort of an adjustment years later to try to compensate for that by increasing taxes. So I think what's maybe important is to look at budgets in isolation, but also to look at cumulative effects over time. And we would have done that a lot during the Great Recession. We would have looked at each year's budget, but also let's put 2 or 3 budgets together and take them more as a package, because as you say, it's likely that taxes may have to increase. And as well, a lot of this will depend on how the economy recovers and how employment gets back to closer to levels it was pre-COVID.
Yeah, no, it's a good answer. I'd forgotten about those cumulative analyses that were done previously, but it will be interesting in time. Yes, Kieran?
Can I just say as well, I suppose, I know you're not suggesting that there should have been tax changes, but I guess the key point as well is that just the sheer profoundly different nature of this downturn as well, in the sense that people are actively being encouraged not to go out and consume or not to engage in certain types of economic activity, and therefore that renders taxation policy, I suppose, almost impotent in the present context. That there's no point in encouraging people to go out and do something that we're, encouraging to do it in an economic sense, but on the other hand, we're saying from a medical sense, don't do it, go out and do it. So I guess that's why, to a certain extent, the policy measures have been, skewed in the way in which they have.
Fair enough. We'll maybe take one more question, and we may as well end on a good and broad social policy question. And again, Paul Lynham has asked the question. So given the success of the PUP in cushioning income loss, and you guys have demonstrated how successful, is there now a clear case for Ireland to introduce a national unemployment insurance model? And I presume what Paul means by that is a sort of an earnings related model of some sort relative to the flat rate one that we have at the moment. So, not necessarily based on the analysis, but does any of you want to comment?
Yeah, so sure, I can jump in on that. So I'm not sure, actually, I'm almost going to say the success of what we've shown today is the welfare system itself has great success in cushioning incomes. And so from that point of view, the existing welfare system provides a huge amount of insurance implicitly to households. And so that's a very important role of the welfare system. And it's, if anything, this crisis has shown it does that very well. Now, there's a question about should that level be higher or not in terms of payments, but that's ultimately kind of a political decision, one for a question about the distribution of resources. But there's also, I think what that question is getting at is, should we have a rates of payment that are more closely linked to like a replacement rate to your previous earnings? And that's a kind of a very different question. I don't think the crisis really says much about that. And that ultimately comes down to a discussion about how important you think the role of insurance is in providing an income floor for people who lose their job versus kind of being able to smooth consumption over time. There's kind of two different components there. And so if anything, I think that the current crisis has shown the importance of having an income floor. And there's maybe questions, the introduction of PUP itself maybe suggested that some in government felt that the level that floor is provided isn't enough for certain groups. But I think it doesn't necessarily make it clear that we need to overhaul the system entirely.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. One thing to bear in mind here is that there will be people, particularly young people who get PUP, that will not be entitled to any benefits because they're students. So there will be students who are getting the pandemic unemployment payment that won't be entitled to job seekers assistance. Or even if we have young people who will be entitled to job seekers assistance, the rates for those under 24 are substantially lower than for the rates of 25-year-olds and above. So that is something that maybe if youth unemployment is going to continue at the rates that higher than before, that is maybe something that will need to be thought about.
Once again, it's been a fascinating presentation, and it does raise a whole series of interesting issues, which I've no doubt we'll be talking about this time next year in terms of economic recovery or not. And again, putting a sort of a budgetary package together after 2 years of sort of 20 billion type deficits, no matter what. I think the set of policy challenges are going to be fascinating this time next year. But again, as always, it's just great to have the detailed analysis from the Switch team on the whole range of issues that have been discussed today. So with that, I think we can draw things to a close. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining in. I want to really thank the presenters for their hard work this morning and for the last week, and indeed for the last many years. Much appreciated. And as I said at the end of the Geary lecture, normally we'd be listening to a loud round of applause for you all, so we can't quite manage that. but I know everybody has enjoyed and appreciated it. So congratulations to you all. And okay, with that, I think we'll sign off. So thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.